Panoptica, Cisco's cloud application security solution, provides continuous cloud application security, compliance, and monitoring at scale, giving customers deep visibility, risk evaluation with context, and actionable remediation insights to secure their entire inventory of cloud assets. Visit panoptica.app to learn more.
Packet pushers.
Welcome to Packet Protector, the podcast at the intersection of networking and security. I'm Drew Conry Murray. JJ's on PTO this week. Today we're talking about the SBOM, or the Software Bill of Materials. Simply speaking, a software bill of materials is a list or record of all the components used in a software product. For software buyers and operators, the impetus for an SBOM is to help them understand what's in this blob of code, and that can be for purposes of licensing or compliance or vulnerability management, and to help illuminate potential supply chain risks. From a security and compliance perspective, SBOMs are being more widely used by organizations to help them address software risks and vulnerabilities, but just how useful are they? We're going to dive into all this with my guest, Tom Pace. He is co-founder and CEO of NetRise. Tom brings many years of security experience to the conversation, including roles at the Department of Energy, at Cylance, and as an advisor and an investor. So Tom, welcome to the podcast. I gave a very brief description of the Software Bill of Materials. Is there more to the SBOM, things we should know?
There's a wide array of other aspects of a software bill of materials we can talk about in terms of when are they produced, how are they produced, are they enriched or not with various sets of metadata, how are they disseminated, things like that. But I think from a high level perspective, you kind of captured what the essence of an SBOM is intended to be. But I think we'll drill into a couple of the other more intimate details here as we continue chatting. But so far, so good.
Yeah, absolutely. Then let's drill in. What is typically included in an SBOM? Obviously, we're talking about software, so I'm thinking libraries, modules, other things. What's inside?
What I find to be confusing, I suppose, is that there is confusion about what's supposed to be in an SBOM. Because in a world, especially in security, that seeks out frameworks and standards and special publications in a pathway in which to do something, you almost can't find more of that than with an SBOM. So in terms of what should be in an SBOM, this is very well described and there's a couple different ways you can look at this. But there's a minimum elements standard document that was put out by the NTIA, who was the governing body out of the Department of Commerce that created this minimum set of elements that should be in a software bill of materials. And so whenever you think about components, which folks often misconstrue as only applications or libraries or dependencies and things like that, which are all true, a component is just a file in the purest sense. If memory serves correctly, it actually says that. So what should be in a software bill of materials is every file that makes up a given thing. It's not every piece of executable code. It's not everything you can identify. It's not every library dependence. It's everything. It is all the things. So this is where usually you need an analogy because you're trying to find some comparative abstraction to put something in a familiar light. With an SBOM, like the ingredients list analogy is kind of perfect. There's almost no difference because in a list of ingredients, do they leave out ingredients because they don't know what they are?
I mean, hopefully not.
I mean, they're not supposed to at least, right? So it's the exact same thing. And so whenever you see from folks or hear from folks, a really big part of a SBOM that is almost unanimously not included is what is known as known unknowns. So what these are, which are fairly obvious, I suppose, by the name, are all of the things in whatever you're analyzing that you don't know what they are, right? And there's a number of reasons for why you might not know what they are. It's first-party code, it's proprietary code, there's no CPE, there's no Perl, there's no unique way to identify that thing based on some other set of data. You can uniquely identify it from a hash or something like that, but only if there's like some external reference to adjudicate that, yes, that is that thing. So all of these different pieces and parts are intended to be included in an SBOM. And I'm just talking about the minimum elements right now still.
Right.
Known unknowns are intended to be in there as a minimum element.
What do you mean by a known unknown?
Known unknown is, so say I get a software application. So I'll give you like a really interesting question about, the software supply chain security problem. I know you're the one asking the questions, but if I could ask you one.
Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
How many files do you think are in the latest version of PowerPoint.exe? If you open it up and look at every file, how many files do you think are in that?
I'm going to guess hundreds.
27,000.
Okay. So way off.
I would have guessed 5 before I started this company. Like I would have never guessed hundreds. I would have been like, what are they all doing? And so this is why an SBOM is so important, because of my misconception and your misconception, right? Initially, we think that, oh, this is just like however many files, there's nothing there. And so when you have known unknowns, and let's just use any application, and say there's 100 components in this application, software.exe, whatever. And out of these 100 components, 50 of them are open source components. We can identify and say, yep, here's OpenSSL, here's OpenSSH, here's glibc, here's whatever. And then the other 50 components, we can see them, right? They're not like hidden. We can see that they are there, but we don't know what they are. Now, they have a file name, they have a path, they have a size, they have like all this metadata associated with them, but we don't know what they are, right? Like think about it this way. If you're walking around on a street and you see a bunch of people, you can say, I just saw 20 people. Can you tell me who those 20 people are? No. Same thing here. You can see the components, but you just don't know what they are. Because whenever you're identifying components, the vast majority of what people are doing is taking things like package managers and identifying all the open source things. And that's all super helpful. You can also identify first party and proprietary components, but oftentimes there's going to be this delta where you just don't know what these things are. And so you just give as much data about them as you can. And those are known as known unknowns.
Okay.
But it's critical that you document those as well. Just because you don't know what it is doesn't mean it's not susceptible to causing you some problem in the future. And so if one of these components that's a known unknown gets compromised somehow, and you're not tracking that in a software bill of materials, which by the way, almost no one is, then you don't have an ability to figure out where else that thing is across your ecosystem.
Okay.
It's a very important aspect of all this that is incredibly ignored.
Okay, so I guess this kind of leads into my next question then. For an enterprise that's licensing and operating software and hardware, what is the purpose of an SBOM?
So the way I would answer this question would be almost with another question, but that's not really intended to be answered. Why do enterprises have asset inventory solutions? Why are you using, even a Tenable or a Armis or a whatever to identify all of the assets that exist in your environment? Pretty obvious, right? Like, because if you don't know what's there, then you can't protect it.
Right.
You need to understand, like, are there devices here that shouldn't be there? Are these things out of date? Is this end of life? I mean, on and on and on and on. It's the exact same use case here, but just for software. So creating a software inventory for all of the things that exist within your environment for all of the exact same reasons. So the best example of this, which everyone's tired of hearing about and I'm tired of talking about, but is just the best one still to talk about for the most part, is the Log4j issue, right? Where organizations still, and I would say 99% of them, if not more, don't have the ability that when asked, do you have this software component, just use Log4j as the example, in your environment? Can you come back to me and give me a confident answer, yes or no?
Okay.
No one can do that.
But ideally, an SBOM would tell me if I had that, if I'm getting it from a vendor and it's accurate, and they use Log4j in their software package.
Depends what you mean by vendor. You don't need to get it from the person publishing the software. You can get it from a third party, right?
Okay. A third party can produce an SBOM?
Yeah, like us. That's what we do.
Okay.
That's literally what we do for a living. We can generate SBOMs. This is a really big depends. Better than a lot of the companies who even produce their own software, which I know hurts a lot of people's brains, but is true in many cases, right? First off, a lot of companies who are producing software, firmware, hardware aren't enormous companies, right? They don't have a full team that knows how to like instrument these workflows. And you know what they're great at? They're great at building this thing, whatever this thing is. They're not security people. They're not DevSecOps people. They're not those people. Now, Microsoft doesn't have any excuses, of course, but the vast majority of companies aren't Microsoft.
Sure.
You have use cases from, open source license management. You have use cases around incident response. You have use cases around third-party risk, procurement. If you're enriching them with vulnerabilities, which tends to be the next most obvious use case for most people, you can incorporate this data into vulnerability management program. You can operationalize this data through a security operations center or a network security infrastructure team. It totally depends on the size of the team and what their risk appetite is. And are they in a regulated market? How much visibility do they desire, et cetera?
Okay, so that's a good question then. Should I expect, the big name software developers in the world, the Microsofts, the Oracles, the SAPs, and so on, to be producing SBOMs? And does it just come with the product, or is it something I have to ask for? And if a company isn't producing an SBOM, it sounds like I can also use tools to create one myself.
They are not, as far as I am aware, these companies are not just delivering SBOMs by default. We have a handful of customers that are very large. And the number of SBOMs that have even been requested, you'd be probably surprised how small that number is. And so that's changing daily right now. This was a conversation that was had probably a year ago. So it was really interesting to hear some of the feedback there. What I find is a number of these end user customers are almost preferring to work with third parties because you're getting a check and balance at the same time. You can always go and ask the vendor. You already have a contractual relationship with a vendor. So you can always ask them. What I've found that people seem to be kind of preferring to do is work with someone who else can generate that, then ask them and do like a comparison essentially. And so, like I said, everyone isn't delivering these by default. I don't even think everybody, including those really large companies, are generating them by default. You have a spectrum of capabilities at these big companies that are more or less able to. So, I mean, you have to imagine, think about a company like Microsoft, how much data that is generating SBOMs for everything.
Right. It would be a lot of work for them.
It's a lot of work. My sympathy is limited for them.
Very limited.
You're what, the third biggest market cap in the world now? And they have a couple bucks laying around.
Yeah.
They can probably handle it.
I'm sure they could.
It's a greater good thing, really. When you're that critical to the world's technology ecosystem, it's pretty imperative that you do a good job there. But yeah, that's the state of affairs right now, I would say. I don't know if you're going to ask at all about the software attestation element that came to be relatively recently, where the federal government is requiring software attestations for things that are being sold there, but that's a whole other piece to that. But
so this is a requirement for companies selling to the federal government. There has to be some kind of software attestation about what's included in that software that's being sold to the government?
Unfortunately, not necessarily what's in it, but how it was developed. So it's more so around, do you have secure software development lifecycle in place? Are you doing vulnerability scanning? I forget what the NIST standard is. It's like SSDF or something. And so the fact that generating an SBOM did not become a mandatory artifact of that process, I think was disappointing to everybody.
Right. You're saying that they just mandated you have to attest that you're doing these essentially sensible software development practices.
Yeah. And it's self-attestation. There's no check and balances, so it's just a giant paperwork exercise that provides essentially zero value.
And SBOM was not part of that. Okay.
Correct. Obviously, I'm a biased persona here in wanting SBOMs to be included, but what value is this providing? All you're doing is creating liability concerns for these companies selling things into the federal government. That's it. That's all you're doing.
Okay.
So that's the game we're playing? Okay. It makes sense that that's what the government would choose, is something that is essentially useless, costs everybody money, and provides no value. So I guess it's status quo.
So you mentioned the NTIA sort of set out guidelines for SBOMs. Are these just guidelines, or are there actual standards on what information should be included and how it should be presented?
The minimum elements are included in the standards that are utilized for SBOMs, which are Cyclone DX and SPDX. So SPDX is maintained by the Linux Foundation, and Cyclone DX is maintained by OWASP. Those standards were created by those organizations and governing bodies, which everybody has a ton of respect for, which is great. That's a great way to do it. And those minimum elements exist in both of those standards in slightly different ways, obviously. Otherwise, we wouldn't have two of them. And so those are prescriptive in terms of what needs to be in there. What I'll tell you is it is shocking how few people are capable of generating a compliant SBOM. It's really amazing how poor that has been, which is unfortunate, right? It's fortunate in the sense that we do it the right way. So that's nice. So if we are in like a head-to-head thing, ours is going to look better. But what's unfortunate about it is it's kind of created this sour taste in some people's mouths, right? Because they just haven't gotten quality results from people.
Sure.
So it's like a rising tide lift all boats thing, and then you have some folks just ruining it. So those minimum elements are intended to be mandatory. There's not like some law or anything like that, but they are mapped to those standards and they are expected to be in there.
Okay. And you said Cyclone DX, and what was the other one?
SPDX.
SPDX. Okay. So if I'm going to, sort of my large software vendor and saying I want an SBOM, I should expect them to conform to one of these two standards?
Everybody should be doing both. There's no reason not to do both. It's not difficult.
Okay.
If you're doing one, do the other at the same time.
Okay. And if I was going to a third-party company that can generate SBOMs from my existing software, I would assume they would also be following these two standards?
Correct.
Okay.
If not, they should not be in this business.
All right. Okay, so it's good to know there is sort of a generally agreed upon format and standard for the SBOM.
This gets talked about a lot. I've ranted on LinkedIn the IT security Twitter, as they call it, about this, where people say like, there's no standards for SBOM. This is why it's like, how many standards do you want, guys? You have the minimum elements from the NTIA. You have Cyclone DX and SPDX from two of the most well-trusted IT institutions on the planet. These things map to multiple NIST special publications. You have an executive order. You have binding operational directives from DHS. There's so many different frameworks that prescribe like what one should do and how one should do it. So this is just people that are uninformed and are, looking to make themselves feel happy on the inside most of the time, who are just incapable of reading. So it's odd to me.
Panoptica, Cisco's cloud application security solution, provides end-to-end lifecycle protection for cloud-native application environments. It empowers organizations to safeguard their APIs, serverless functions, containers, and Kubernetes environments. Panoptica ensures comprehensive cloud security, compliance, and monitoring at scale, offering deep visibility, contextual risk assessments, and actionable remediation insights for all your cloud assets. Powered by graph-based technology, Panoptica's attack path engine prioritizes and offers dynamic remediation for vulnerable attack vectors, helping security teams quickly identify and remediate potential risks across cloud infrastructures. Panoptica utilizes advanced attack path analysis, root cause analysis, and dynamic remediation techniques to reveal potential risks from an attacker's viewpoint. Visit panoptica.app to learn more.
So if I am an enterprise and I decide I'm going to start embracing SBOMs, which parts of the organization would typically be consumers for these things? It sounds like security is one. Are there others?
Yeah, I mean, security is definitely one. Third-party risk would be another one. Bigger organizations are going to have dedicated supply chain security teams. So that's been very appealing to them. Vulnerability management teams has picked up a lot of steam, I think. And so anytime you're getting into one of those teams, like one of these operational teams, like vulnerability management or incident response, you're automatically going to find yourself eventually in the SOC, right?
Right.
So the data just will find itself there somehow, eventually. So those are like the general teams. You do have this element around legal and procurement and things like that. I think that is a longer term significant use case. I think right now it's early for people to be making decisions there because everyone is not doing a great job. You know what I mean? To use like an SBOM and the data in it as a gating mechanism or something, unless there's like something super egregious, I think it should really be more of a risk identification. And then you continue working with the vendors over time to get things remediated and do all that.
Okay, so it sounds like the folks associated with managing risk are the primary consumers, and then it might at some point trickle down to legal.
Yes. Yeah, if you're talking about enterprises, buying these things, the other aspect here is people forget that the vast majority of these enterprises are also writing their own software. So some of them should be doing something already, right? So this shouldn't be, it's always interesting to me when I find this to be like a foreign concept to especially very big organizations. They're like, yeah, well, what do we do with this? I'm like, okay, you guys write code, right? They're like, oh yeah, we write tons of code. I'm like, can you guys tell me what's in that code you write? They're like, yeah. And I go, okay, well, how are you doing that? And they go, oh, I see. Right?
But you don't just want to have a conversation. You mean you want me to show you documentation?
Yeah, it's interesting. Those would be the various teams. And then obviously in certain industries, you'll have more specific teams like OT security teams or whatever. It just depends.
I've been thinking of SBOMs in the context of essentially, shrink-wrapped enterprise software. And I know software is not shrink-wrapped anymore, but I think you know what I mean, like software that I would license from a big name vendor. Can SBOMs also be applied to things like open source software? Is this something I might want to apply to sensitive workloads running in the public cloud on their infrastructure or software as a service?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, there's no reason not to do that. I think some of the issues you run into, especially for cloud things, is that's a moving target. It's much more of a moving target than other things for obvious reasons and for good reasons. So this is where perfect is the enemy of good.
Sure.
When you start talking about SaaS stuff, especially. Not to say that it can't be instrumented and not to say that like real-time visibility can't be provided. There are ways to do that, but just recognize that, let's crawl and walk before we run because some of that instrumentation is just going to probably take a bit longer. When I'm talking with investors or when I raise around and people are doing diligence on the company and things like that, I have to provide a list of the software from an open source perspective and other aspects that I'm running in our cloud. So, and that's not like a difficult process for us to do. It takes us like, I don't know, an hour or something. You know what I mean? So from a SaaS perspective, certainly. And then also from a shrink wrap perspective, definitely. We care about individual binaries that are being downloaded from the internet or coming through email to an extraordinary degree, right? Because that could be malware,
right?
Drew.
Yep.
Could be malware. No telling what it could be. Could be the end of the world, right? But then we go buy software from someone and we just go install that stuff, guys. Don't even worry about it. Install that bad boy. Nothing could happen.
Because we're assuming some degree of due diligence has been performed, although
that's a crazy mindset.
Yes, experience tells us otherwise.
There's no world where that mindset reflects reality. It just doesn't. So now, granted, you have to have some level of trust inherently, right? And I'm not saying that we put the brakes on installing software around the world. But what I am saying is create an inventory, get visibility into the things that exist within all this other software that you're buying and putting into your environment so that, you can make decisions over time. The analogy I've used time and time again around this market or space or however you want to kind of characterize it is very similar to the early days of EDR. And what I mean by that is EDR created an entirely new set of data that nobody had before, right? And if you look at the early days, people didn't really know what to do with it. What am I going to do with every single process execution event on my thousands of Windows machines? What am I going to do with those?
Right.
Pump them to a SIM. And then, what am I going to do? But over time, I think the EDR market's worked out okay for a couple people. Drew.
It has. Yeah.
I think that's safe to say. And so I think this represents a very, very similar market driver. Now, it's getting an amount of friction that is just so confusing to me. And I think a lot of that is it represents a lot of transparency to a lot of very, very large organizations that maybe aren't thrilled about that. And I know why that is because we've looked at an enormous amount of code. And so we can certainly understand why some of them aren't over the moon about having 25-year-old software components identified in brand new things. So that's what I think you have going on here.
Yes.
But the number of companies and the number of use cases and the means in which we operationalize this data is, I have lots of ideas. A lot of other people have lots of ideas, but it is going to engender a entirely new market. And it's going to eventually change the way everybody does things because you're essentially looking at the foundation and the bedrock of how everything is built, everything, and doing that at scale, which has its challenges, but is not impossible by any stretch.
So we've been talking about, software sort of as a standalone entity. Can I get SBOMs for the software that comes sort of on my vendor hardware or appliances or for IoT devices? Is it possible to get in there and see what's on there?
Yeah, absolutely. So, that is where NetRise started. We started off by generating SBOMs as well as a number of other things. We think of ourselves as a software supply chain security company that created a software supply chain risk management platform where an SBOM is but one artifact that is generated as a result of that analysis. So sure, you can take a binary blob that represents a firmware image for a router, switch, VPN, IoT device, ICS device, automobile, satellite, whatever, and generate a software bill of materials for that thing, for sure.
So it sounds like if I'm requesting SBOMs, looking at SBOMs, working with SBOMs, how would I slot this into sort of like my vulnerability management operations? Where does it sit?
The way we think about it is you're going to have a couple different elements in locations in which you can operationalize this. You'll have some things that you're able to fix on your own. That's one bifurcation point. You're not able to just kind of arbitrarily fix everything that's identified. That's just not the way that goes. And then using this data to significantly inform the actual risk that exists on whatever it is. Let's think about like an edge router that's connected to the internet, which is, what routers do, or a firewall or whatever. If you scan that device with a well-known vulnerability scanner, all it's going to do is identify a handful of issues that are exposed over those ports and services that it can see at the time you scan. It's incapable, and not because it's bad, just not what it does, of identifying all of the components, et cetera, that exist within that device that can also introduce risk for obvious reason. It's why it's so interesting to me that people can't get there on this point when imagine if I said to everyone, all we're going to do is scan our Windows environment with a vulnerability scanner and we're good to go, right? Everyone would be like, no, we're not. We're not good. But that is exactly what we say. especially for like IoT devices and things running that. The big obvious elephant in the room is you don't have users on those things all day, every day. But nonetheless, you still have the same kind of challenges. So being able to take the data that is generated and derived from an SBOM, and now you can take action from actual data to say, okay, I know these components are in here. I know these vulnerabilities exist. I can monitor for X, Y, and Z. So now I know to look for these particular issues or this kind of network traffic, or maybe I should segment these things over here. And so you now have much more comprehensive data to make better risk decisions that can inform your vulnerability management program.
Right. I can set up remediations, outside of having patches to apply.
Yep. Or mitigations in that case.
Yeah. Mitigations. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And, some of the pushback and objections I get, which I'm not saying are unreasonable, but I like to think I have a good answer for, is, well, Tom, if I can't fix these things, then I don't want to know about it. First off, you're in the wrong industry then. And the other thing I would say is that comment only holds water if you've also patched every vulnerability in your environment that you can patch.
Right.
Which I've never met one company on planet Earth that's done that successfully.
Mm-hmm.
Not to mention you have all these companies who build applications or they build their own things. And they're like, okay, we found these vulnerabilities in this application stack. We need to update that library. And people will lose their minds, right? If you update that, it's going to break this and, blah, blah, blah. So there's already precedent for identifying risk that you're not going to fix, but is worth knowing about so that you can understand what's going on. I had a meeting recently with a very large financial services company. And the comment was said to me, basically, if we can't address the risk, then we really don't kind of want to know. It was basically said in those terms. And
sure.
My response was just very obvious. I said, okay, let me get this straight. Large financial institution, your stance is when a risk is identified that you cannot address, you would rather not know about that. And there was a very senior person in the room who said, let me make it real clear, Tom, that is not our stance. And I was like, yeah, of course it's not your stance.
Certainly not a public stance.
It's not their stance for anything. In fact, they're most interested in the risks they can't fix because that's how they have to underwrite everything that they do.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
Right? Think about all the risks that you can't address in your life.
I mean, I have no influence over Boeing's quality control when I get on a plane. I just have to ride that plane.
Exactly. And then on the other side, you don't go walk around in the middle of the woods at night by yourself where there's known to be lots of bears or something. Right?
Right. Right.
Would you rather not know that there?
Right.
Of course
right.
not. Of course not. It's just not true in any aspect of life. And so it's always a interesting dynamic when I have these conversations with people. I'm not immune to the fact, that we're generating a lot more data than people are expecting to get. And that it's creating a lot of work. That's why all of these opportunities are going to come based on this data, because they're just going to have to. And obviously, we hope that we can address as many of them as we possibly can. But we're not going to be able to do everything. When I start getting pushback like that, that tells me, okay, we're doing something right. That's good objections.
You found a sore spot, yeah.
Correct.
Although I guess I would say lots of organizations are already struggling to keep up with vulnerability management and patch management. And if I'm barely able to do that, is an SBOM actually helping me with my risk management or more information that just gets thrown on the giant heap behind me?
Well, vulnerabilities are not a mandatory field in an SBOM. So you can choose what you want to solve for with an SBOM. If you're just trying to say there's an incident response use case for a software bill of materials that basically says, okay, we know that this software component is being compromised for whatever reason. And we need to figure out, do we have that software component anywhere in our environment?
Got it. Okay.
You don't need to know anything about vulnerabilities at that point.
Right.
You just need to know, do I have that thing somewhere? By the way, this is the exact use case for EDR early on. You didn't know what process was good or bad initially. You had no idea.
Uh-huh.
But then you would find out, you'd get some TTPs or an IOC, or your spam filter would find something and then you would be able to track that down and figure out okay, now I know the malicious executable that ran or malicious process. How can I figure out, did that process run on any of my machines? It's a pretty valuable use case.
Sure.
And that's what we're solving for, but just from a software perspective.
Got it. So it's not just about vulnerability or patch management. There are other use cases.
It's not just about vulnerabilities. In fact, part of me wants to just say, don't do vulnerabilities at all, because it just breaks everyone's brains. Because what ends up happening is, I might have even showed you this when we met in San Francisco. People have an expectation that when they get a firmware, image, a software package, an application, whatever it is from some vendor, that it is without vulnerability, right? That is the expectation. In our experience, that has been true a grand total of 0 times.
Right.
And so you're really breaking people's mental model for how the world is supposed to be. And that just creates an amount of friction that can be difficult to overcome, which is why I enjoy it so much. Right? I mean, that's what's fun. What's fun is making people really understand what's going on here. If you're getting a brand new operating system from Microsoft and you apply every single patch, by definition, there's no vulnerabilities. Can't be further from the truth. Cannot be further from the truth, right?
Right.
I'm not even talking about 0 days. If PowerPoint.exe has 27,000 files, who here thinks that all 27,000 of those files, which also are libraries and components and dependencies, et cetera, all of them are at the latest version. And just because you're at the latest version does not mean there's no CVEs either. Most of the time that's true, but that's not always true. It's just never the case. Times that by God knows how many in the Windows operating system. All the DLLs, all the drivers, it's crazy.
So if customers start requesting SBOMs, from their bigger software and hardware providers, and SBOMs start to be more widely used for risk management, is there a chance that software quality might improve down the line, or is that just wishful thinking?
If we're making SBOMs part of this process, I tell people all the time, this is a 20-year problem.
Sure. Or longer. Yeah.
This is not like, all right, we got SBOMs now, everybody. We're good to go. Not even close.
Job done.
Yeah. And that's especially true in the firmware space, in embedded operating system space, because those changes take a very long time. And once again, there's good reasons for that and maybe a couple bad ones, but overwhelmingly good ones, I think. So absolutely, that will happen over time. Like the toothpaste is out of the tube from an SBOM perspective. And I don't care. Frankly, I would almost appreciate it if we came up with a different word other than SBOM that communicated this in a better way, like software transparency. I mean, there's a bunch of other things people say, but you're exactly right. That will be the outcome over time, is that you will just have better written software that's more up to date and has less risk, et cetera. Unless the market just doesn't demand that. The market is going to drive this like it always does.
Yeah, well, that's why I was sort of maybe prompting our audience to be like, maybe start asking some of your bigger vendors about SBOMs. Let's get it rolling.
Absolutely. We have customers who, I'll give you an example of something that won us a deal, which we had nothing to do with, but this scenario made them go, what the hell? So they have a security appliance, doesn't matter who it's from. They applied the latest update to it as part of their process. They scan that device after they do that, just with a normal vulnerability scanner. And in so doing, identified the latest, this was like back in December of last year, I think. At the time, there was that big Apache Struts remote code execution vulnerability that had come out. And so they updated a security appliance and in return got the gift of a remote code execution vulnerability on their security appliance that now they could not fix. Find me an organization who says, I would rather not know about that and please retire from cybersecurity. Like, go away. You are the problem. And so that dynamic for them was just like, okay, we need to have something that can be a shim in between when we apply updates. Because just applying an update is not always the most secure thing, because you have scenarios oftentimes where you're adding new features and capabilities as part of that update. And if you're adding new features and capabilities, you're introducing new libraries and new whatever, right? It's just normal.
Yep.
So organizations are waking up to this for sure.
Well, that does bring us to the end of our conversation, Tom. Thank you for helping open my eyes to SBOMs and the value there. And hopefully folks have a better understanding of what an SBOM is and how they might be able to take advantage of it. If folks want to connect with you somewhere online, or where are you available? You mentioned LinkedIn. Are you there? Yeah,
LinkedIn's great. I get bombarded on a fairly frequently basis. So bombard away. I'm actually very good at getting back to people on there, as long as you're not just trying to sell me like another explainer video or something.
Right. Please, no sales.
Yeah, I mean, I never knew so many explainer video companies existed. I really didn't know. And apparently I need software development help out of Africa very bad. And I didn't even know I needed it. That's a big gap for us. So yeah, LinkedIn's probably best, or you can reach out on our website, netrise.io. There's a number of ways to fill out forms. We get back to people incredibly fast there. That'd be the best ways.
Awesome. We'll have the links to those in the show notes that accompany this episode. Thank you, Tom, for joining us. And thanks to you for listening to this episode of Packet Protector. If you've got comments, corrections, or topics you'd like us to cover, or anything else to tell us, you can hit us up at packetpushers.net/FU. The FU stands for follow-up. While you're there, check out all the other podcasts in our network, including things like Heavy Wireless with Keith Parsons, Network Automation Nerds with Eric Cho, IPv6 Buzz, Heavy Networking, Day 2 Cloud, and more. As always, thanks for listening.